thank you, Christoph. I'm actually so impressed because we had this conversation on Monday, and we were joking about how I learned so much about Christoph, and I have fun things to say if I ever had to introduce him. But he's captured a lot of what I talked about as well, and so that trajectory. So thank you so much for a generous introduction of all the metamorphisms. And in some ways, I haven't lost this interest in metamorphism. So I will talk a little bit about it today. There are a couple of things, of course, with all Christoph's stories that aren't quite accurate. So if anyone wants to get the actual facts, you can come talk to me about that too. But today, I want to talk to you about what's really interesting me now. And I guess I'll set the clock on this so I don't go over on time. But I am really interested in Indigenous ecocinema. I've been interested in ecocinema for a long time. And it's the project that I'm going to talk to you about today is very new, so I do want to really thank the Rachel Carson Center, because this last month that I've been here, I've been sort of thinking through this. But then, of course, my institution, and most importantly, the filmmakers, the Indigenous filmmakers that I've been working with to look at their work. So I want to make sure I thank all of them. What I want to do today is really focus in on this one film that I've been thinking about this last month. It's called A Lodge by Terrell Calder, who's Métis, which is an Aboriginal Indigenous group in Canada. And what this film does is it speaks very, very specifically to the title of the talk, in this notion of animating our relations, because it's an animated film. So I'm going to talk about that. But then if you notice, I've changed the title a little bit over here, and I say cinematic spaces. And I wanted to emphasize that it didn't fit nicely in the title, but it does over here. And I want to emphasize the idea of cinema, because for me, as an eco-cinema scholar, I'm really, really interested in cinema as a space that negotiates our relations, ecological relations, and one that we have to implicate in these negotiations. So most of the talk I'll spend on that, but I think it's only fair to give you a sense of the bigger picture. So, oops, this is what happens when you switch from a Mac to a PC, 1 and 1, as opposed to 1 and 2. I try to catch them all, but they're really just two things I'm going to talk about: a little bit of the bigger project, and then a close reading of The Lodge. And I should say I do have a clip, but I have it for the very end if we have time. So I won't be showing you clips of the film, but I'll be showing you stills of the film to get at what I'm talking about. So let's talk a little bit more about the bigger project, this notion of eco-sensibilities of Indigenous cinema. And what I want to do here is I want to give you the objective of the bigger project as the sort of what, and that lead us into thinking a little bit about the why, which I'll sort of present as the argument that I see this project making. So there's two layers to the objective, and I'm just going to read them for you. It's to draw from a wide range of contemporary fictional films made by Indigenous people to demonstrate how through diverse means in genre, form, narrative, etc., they evoke eco-critical appeals. So you've noticed I've highlighted 3 words in there. The words that I haven't highlighted are contemporary and fictional, and I'll be happy to talk about that later, but I want to focus in on these 3. A number of people while I've been here have asked me, what do you mean by Indigenous? What is that, Indigenous cinema? And I very specifically look at cinema that's made by Indigenous people. And what I'm doing here is I'm grounding myself in Indigenous cinema scholarship, which suggests that when you think of Indigenous people and they're taking control, so there's the term visual sovereignty, taking control, having the camera in their own hands, what you're seeing there is a way in which Indigenous people tell their own stories. So a resistance to the way other people have told their stories. And it relates very closely to thinking about mainstream cinema, ethnographic cinema, which is represented indigenous people as the other. And so I'm really interested in self-representations. What are indigenous people saying about themselves? And in that interest, what I'm also very interested in doing is talking about diversity, because often in these mainstream stereotypes you see the sense of indigenous people as one homogeneous lot. And I want to get at the sense that no, of course, they're peoples, they're all over the world, there are different ways in which they engage with the world. So I'm really interested in teasing out some of that diversity by looking at different kinds of films and thinking of their diversity over there to get at eco-critical appeal. So I want to say a little bit more about that, but just to give you a sense of how I'm trying to get at some of that diversity. There's lots over here. Because I'm a cinema scholar, I'm also situating myself in film studies. I'm interested in things like genre, formal modes, affect, and context as well. With the certificate program students this last weekend, I subjected them to some sci-fi cinema, but there are different kinds of cinema that I'm looking at and trying to think of what they're doing as they make their films. And this notion of taking cinema and these sort of very cinematic terms is something that people in indigenous cinema studies have done, and I want to draw on a quote that the scholars Elise Marubio and Eric Buffalo have used to describe this kind of cinema when you're thinking about indigenous cinema specifically, and they use this notion of cinema that talks back and moves forward. Because there's this sense of indigenous people resisting mainstream cinema, there's that notion of talking back. But there's also, well, where then? What does it mean to talk back? How do you move forward? So in some ways that's not new, but that notion really grounds me in thinking about how we talk back and move forward with eco-critical or ecological valences. So that's something that no one has actually really spent too much time thinking about, either in eco-cinema studies, mainstream studies, or even in indigenous cinema studies. So that's a notion that really grounds the argument of this bigger project. And thinking of eco-cinema, thinking of this notion of talking back and moving forward eco-critically. So what I want to suggest then, that the central argument of the book rests on the notion that if we start reading, doing these complex readings, then we can show how indigenous cinema can perform two eco-revisionary purposes. And I want to highlight those as arguments. So, one, what I'm trying to get at is the revisionary aspect of centering historically marginalized voices and visions. So as I mentioned now, we haven't paid attention to it, and that's typical of environmental rhetoric in general, environmental action in general, mainstream. So how do we bring this back? So there's a component of historical revision in this project. But then there's another aspect of thinking of revision, and just to be sort of smart about it, I put a hyphen, smart, I don't know if it's smart, to emphasize it. I put a hyphen between that to give you the sense of vision, and that's the sense of moving forward, or what does it mean for our presence and futures. And here really thinking of it as possibilities of living in the Anthropocene. So what I'd like to argue is that much indigenous cinema is particularly productive as eco-cinema because its practices often evoke ecological sensibilities that align well with current environmental humanities calls to resist the narrative binary logics which have shaped the eco-crises of the Anthropocene. As an art form, indigenous cinema defies stereotypical and hierarchical boundaries of modernity, traditionality, indigenous, Western, nature, culture, by drawing attention to different subjectivities and agencies of non-human and human. And you notice I italicize human here, And I do that because that's something else that this cinema draws our attention to, issues of environmental justice, of the human implicated within thinking of how we think about the non-human. So these alternative ways of seeing and engaging subjectivity and agency are, and I'm going to reference Kirsten's talk here because she said this, exactly the same thing with her museum ideas, but I think they're important because they invite creative ways of thinking our way through some of our contemporary crises precisely because they're different. So when I do this, the other thing that I'm doing is I'm aligning my own work with work that's happening at these intersections. And the important thing that I want to mention is I'm not interested in appropriations of indigenous epistemologies just for Western work. But instead, I'm interested in conversations that align indigenous thought and Western ecological thought to engage both of these, historical redress, but also thinking about equitable and ethical ways of future livability. So I'm drawing from people like Joni Adamson, I'm drawing from people like Isabel Stengers, Deborah Bird Rose, and thinking of how these can come together. So that is my short little introduction to the big project. And the rest of the talk, I really want to focus in on the film itself as an example that might help show how I see some of these arguments playing out in the cinema itself. So back to where we were, the lodge, but this time you have a picture of the filmmaker as well, Terrell Calder, and the argument, of course, that I'm going to make is that she revisions. But what I want to draw attention to is how she's revisioning animal relations as well as human relations, and then how she's revisioning cinema as a space for these places. So a little bit about Terrell as a Métis artist, because I don't know if everyone knows, but the Métis people are recognized as one of the 3 Aboriginal groups of Canada, but they're mixed heritage, so they have European and Indigenous blood, but within colonial systems, within national systems, they were always recognized as Aboriginal, and because of the way they were treated. Because they were sort of considered half-breeds. So they were discriminated in many of the same ways Indigenous people, other Indigenous communities in Canada were discriminated. But I draw that attention to you because it draws us to the specifics of what Terrell's getting at. She's very interested in this notion of hybridity and this notion of what it means to be Indigenous within these power systems. And so she has this film, it's a feature-length film, an animated film, and just to say, give you a one-line summary of what it is about. The Lodge follows Pearl Simpson, a British war bride from the 1940s, who comes to Canada to live in the Canadian wilderness with her Métis husband, who she meets in England during the war. And this is her Métis husband. Okay? So, one thing we know right away when we think about the story, and now I'm starting to get into the analysis of this story. Pearl is our storyteller. From the very first scenes where we see her dreaming of her escape from the 1940s wartime Britain and our introduction to the film world through her voiceover, we are invited to align with her perspective. Yet, Calder complicates this white outsider perspective and Pearl's personal story through her use of animation, genre play, affective address to tell an eco-sociologically grounded story about Métis experiences and cinema as a negotiator of some of these experiences. So in essence, what I'm going to argue is that she draws our attention to these different kinds of subjective relations. So let's think a little bit about that. First, what I want to say about the film is that Calder really creates a multi-layered animation scape. So there are different stories that weave in and out. There's the story of Pearl, and it's stop frame animation. So you have these dolls, and then you have Pearl, and you have the settings as well. But then on top of that story of Pearl, which is very much about her immediate present in the 1940s in Canada, there's additional stories that she weaves in using a different style of animation. So there's cell composite animation that she uses to tell these legends. So the central to the film is the legend of Dandelion, which is an Anishinaabe legend. But then she also has a version of the old Scottish Goldilocks and the Three Bears stories that she brings in as well. So there's those layers. That's not enough for her. She creates yet another layer, and she intersplices into these two stories another form of animation in black and white of the story of the Canadian beaver, which she presents as this sort of mix of the stop frame and cell animation. So each of these stories allow for a genre play. So she's giving us a sense of melodrama and working with that genre. In the main story, of course, is a documentary, and then the fairy tales as well. What she's doing as she's doing the genre play, though, is she's also setting up a fluid positioning of animal and human characters. So you have Pearl, you have the beaver. But she heightens this because of the animation form. Because not only do they exist in these parallel stories, but they coexist together in Pearl's story. Okay? So they're interwoven into her immediate relation. And this is something that I want to draw attention to, because animation scholars, eco-animation scholars have. So people like Ursula Hayes, David Whitley, and others suggest that animation has this unique characteristic to co-presence animals, often as talking characters. Because it's drawn and sculptured, the form. It's not live action. In these worlds of co-present, we're often invited to rethink the notion of the non-human other. And Calder's using this sort of formal invitation to further thematic interest or attention to these notions of animation. So specifically, she sets up attention. We know that Pearl is our storyteller. When we encounter the world through Pearl's perspective, though, we get a sense of denigrated human-animal relations. Just a sense of disrespect. And I want to show you how through the forms that she has. So one, through Pearl's perspective, her husband, Hunter, is this groveling wolf dog, kind of like shameful. She suspects her husband of having a native lover, and she sees that that person is a cunning vixen. Yeah, I just love that. I love that doll. She treats her own native lover as a sort of dumb but kind of devoted bear. But that's not all. Even though she doesn't want to see herself as an animal, she sees herself as a sniveling rat. At the start of the film, we get a sense of why that is, because she's this fallen woman in England, and this sense of being a rat sort of encompasses that shamefulness. So in all, we're seeing these images of humans really denigrated as animals when we're in her perspective. But despite the fact that she's understanding, that Pearl is understanding animality in these ways, Calder's filming choices, her use of animation, bump up against this point of view. Most noticeably, as coexistent beings, the animal others are scaled to Pearl's size, and they live alongside her. Despite the animal appearances, they have very enduring characteristics. And here we can see the wolf husband and the bear lover both really attending to Pearl's well-being. So as Hayes suggests in her eco-critical readings, quote, as obviously anthropomorphic as most of these highly individualized characters may be, they manage to unsettle the spectator precisely by making it unclear what exactly the characters of human and animal mean. In this animated film world, Pearl and the characters blur the boundaries between human-like agency and non-human bodies. And this blurring is very consistent with Calder's Métis sensibilities. And when I talked to her, she gave me this example. Pearl sees us as animals when she's dehumanizing us. But that's really part of our animal selves, which we don't mind being. A huge part of my culture is to gain a clearer understanding of my animal self and to honor that connection. So she's repositioning animality, and as she does so, Calder is doing it not only through these sort of strategic alignments of her dolls, but also cinematically in other ways where she plays with animation. And I'm going to just stop a sec and say, what do you think of when you think animation? We usually think of children's cartoons or things that are playful. And Calder uses that to her advantage. She thinks of that playfulness. And I have a scene over here that gets a little bit at it. Here, Pearl's been lying to Hunter about how she got scratched. And she says, it's the rose bushes in my garden. But actually, she was almost drowning and her lover had to save her. And what you see in this moment over here, there's an eye roll. Hunter's making this sort of eye roll where you understand he's not as dumb as she thinks he is. So there's this moment when Calder sort of invites the audience into a knowing allegiance where you start to suspect Pearl as the storyteller of this story. And the film is really replete with these visual and audio counter moves to Pearl's spoken narration. As we begin to suspect her as a reliable storyteller, we become aware of a counter storyteller. One that's not a character in the film, but one that's invisible, except in the body as film. So this attention to the counter storyteller is important because Calder's explicitly making us aware of a different kind of blurred human, non-human agency, that of cinema as the material discursive being through which we are encountering the story. In this example, animation's plasmaticness, which is a notion that was first suggested by filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein and refers to the ability of animation to allow for this flexible morphing in ways that live action doesn't quite get to. This plasmaticness draws our attention to the counter storyteller. So there are these two layers of non-human, human agency that Calder starts making us think of. And the best version of this is in the final sort of a cinema. It's not the final scene, but it's a cinematic scene where she kind of layers them together. So at this point in the film, it's towards the end of the film, and Pearl's sort of reassessing her life. I'm not going to give too much away of the story, but she's reassessing her life. And at this point, this is the first time she sees Hunter as a human. And there's a plasmatic transformation, so that notion of morphing, which is what plasmatic gets at, you go from the wolf being to the human being. But you might say, this privilege is an anthropomorphic viewpoint because we're moving to a human. But Calder complicates that. And it's the way she complicates is by intersplicing the Canadian beaver into this story. So we're learning about Pearl and her problems, and then suddenly we're in this beaver story. And these seemingly different stories, the objective natural history, and then the subjective story of Pearl's struggles, coalesce. And Calder's choice to sculpt both human and beaver with expressions of affective possibility elevates both to the same plane. So the lines between whose lives invite our ethical consideration start to blur. The other thing that's really important about this scene is that at this point we also most explicitly aware of the systems that shape our understandings and a sense of oppression towards both human and non-human. And so her choice of using the Canadian beaver is very strategic because it ties into national ideas of Canada. And we see that these entangled but sort of personal lives of beavers and Métis and even Pearl sort of come together under this exploitive system that frames concepts of animality, race, and gender. Here, as throughout the film, Calder's use of animation is telling of the complexity, because Pearl, who's our story's villain, is also a victim, a woman whose sexuality is as much at the heart of this story as our questions of Métis identity. So what I want to stress at this point is how the Lodge draws our attention to the way cinema itself is tied up in these systems of oppression. She deliberately makes us aware of cinema as the construct, material and discursive. One, through her stop frame figures, and then two, through the way she frames the shots itself, whether it is in the case of this natural history documentary, which is in black and white, so you immediately realize you're watching something, but she also does this with Pearl's own story. So there are images that we see in black and white that are framed to get at Pearl. And in fact, there's a lot in the film where we become aware of film itself. This is really important because it's part of that tradition of Calder talking back to Western cinema. In this case, she's really implicating it as in its conceptions of race, gender, animality. So she's unsettling these spaces of what we think of as cinema as she's doing this. But what I want to say, and I think I'm getting to the end of my talk here, just want to see, yep. Actually, we do have time for a clip at the end, so that's good. What I also want to say at this point is she doesn't sort of end with talking back. She thinks of moving forward, and I want us to think about this aspect of moving forward. Through her self-reflexive play with film as form, she reminds us of how cinema can interrupt its vast socio-ecological complicity. As animation especially, the film's materiality helps us both recognize its own construction and reevaluate the meanings of such construction. So I want to push on this a little bit. It's because it's an exciting eco-potentiality of the form of animation itself. So as viewers, we're aware that stop frame is ultimately just inanimate dolls. Yet, within the viewing rules, we allow ourselves to be drawn into the illusion of animus. And we allow ourselves to engage with the life that's breathed in to these dolls and these objects. The invitation to imagine is very useful, because we might say, what does it mean to take the next step and consider how such imagination might make room for a sense of agency and value in what we don't usually see as full of agency, be it objects, animals, or people. When it's linked to narrative themes that ask these same questions, which we hopefully have seen, the animated and playful form of indigenous cinema, in this case, invites a creative and often very non-threatening space to recognize the possibilities and pleasures of alternative relations. And this, to me, is the powerful eco-critical message of revision and revision that films like this afford us. And I'm still working my way through it, so your feedback and your questions are going to be very, very helpful. There's a lot more going on in this film that I haven't got to. I haven't talked too much about production and reception, but there are other things as well that show up. But in all, hopefully what I've shared with you helps get the sense of this film version working to revision. And I'm actually going to stop there, and we have time, yes? I have a 1.5 minute clip that I thought I'd show, because there's something about the audio that, of course, we completely lose the audio when we're doing this. So let me see if I can go over and look at the audio as Lisa gives us some audio. Okay, so before I started, I would say this clip that I'm going to show, let's see if I can get it up.
They say that the trapper would
Wait.
never in the bush.
Okay, hold on. Okay. So the clip I'm going to show, let me see if I can make it so that it's the whole film. Yeah.
They say that the trapper would never skin the beaver in the bush.
Wait. Okay, sorry. So it really is that climatic scene that I was talking about. This is where the little bit about the beaver comes in, but we'll start right at that moment where she sees Hunter as a human, but she's also thinking about what that means. So.
They say that the trapper would never skin the beaver in the bush. He would lug the entire carcass home to ensure that he would do the best job possible disconnecting the hide from its owner. They called it black gold. It was a tedious job and a demanding one, but that was a small price to pay, and for some, it was their only means of survival. The trapper could barter the pelts for European goods such as beads, ribbons, liquor, and guns. All of which became increasingly invaluable in this new incarnation of a civilized society.
I wanted to just end with the clip, so I actually am not going to say anything more.